Hello everyone, I'm MJ Albanna and I'm hosting this event with Stephanie Webster and Suresh Ghalsasi. We're all executive MBA students at the London Business School. And we're excited to be back with another of our faculty events with a very interesting topic. Stephanie, you want to tell us what the topic is?
Yeah, so as I was saying a little bit earlier, we're talking about psychedelics and talking about mental health in general. So we work in the medical field. We see different treatments. We see patients responding to certain treatments, not responding to other treatments. We don't always know why. And it's just interesting to see over the last couple of years how certain drugs that were associated with the party scene have now been acquired by different companies to be produced in the pharmaceutical industry for mental health conditions. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Excellent, great. So before I start, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to be with us and the audience for dialing in and for submitting questions. So on our panelists, we have Professor Nico Sava, he's a professor of management science and operations at London Business School. We've got Dr. Misha Engineer, a London Business School alumnus and managing director of Surrey Pharma. We've got Michael Cunniff, a London Business School alumnus as well, and the lead of finance at Atai Life Sciences, which is a biotech company involved in the development of treatments from psychedelics. We have Professor Roger McIntyre. He's a professor of psychiatry, as well as pharmacology at the University of Toronto. He is also the CEO of Champignon Brands, a human optimization sciences company with an emphasis on ketamine and psychedelic medicine. We have Tim Gray, who's a biohacker, founder and CEO of the Health Optimization Summit. We have Dr. Mohammad Al-Suwaidan. He's the assistant professor of psychiatry at both University of Kuwait and University of Toronto. And last but not least, we've got Dr. David Rabin, a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, and executive director at the Board of Medicine. Welcome all.
Nice to see you again, Dr. David Rabin. I can see your background there. Looks really interesting and exciting. Looking forward to speaking to you later, but we're going to start off with Professor Nico Sava, London Business School. We cannot wait to do your elective. So Suresh, MJ and I are doing your elective in December, managing healthcare. And on that point, we wanted to know, how is the managing of mental healthcare different to managing general healthcare? Are there differences in the management of these two areas?
Hi, Stephanie. Can you hear me well enough?
Yeah,
yes,
well,
awesome. So let me just say how wonderful it is to get to spend the next couple of hours with you. I mean, events like this remind me what a special privilege it is to be a member of the London Business School community. You guys are what makes LBS great, what keeps us at the top of the rankings, and what makes it for me a wonderful place to be working for. You know, your eclectic set of interests, including sort of, you know, the repurposing of psychedelic drugs to solve sort of, you know, a serious problem for our society is kind of, you know, an example of the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that takes place at the London Business School that, you know, I love to be a part of sort of, you know, every day really of my working life. So, you know, Stephanie, you're asking a great question. So, you know, how is mental health different to sort of, you know, other fields of care, at least on the sort of, you know, delivery side? And I just want to make one observation, which is sort of, you know, the following. Like in most sort of healthcare globally, there is a mismatch between supply and demand. And a mismatch is always in the same direction. There's, largely speaking, with very few exceptions, an undersupply of you know, qualified personnel, being doctors and other carers, and an undersupply of medicine, again, with very few exceptions of some very well-developed countries where, in some pockets there might be oversupply, but in general there's undersupply. Now, this undersupply, I think, is particularly acute in mental health care. And I was just looking at some numbers before I joined the panel, and WHO talks about 1 in 4 of us will be affected by mental health issues during our lives. At the moment, there's something like 500 million people that are actively battling a mental health issue. And something like between 7 and 10% of the global burden of disease is associated with mental health, which is to put it in perspective, about half of the burden of cancer. So mental health is a serious area with a huge demand. Now, if you look at the supply side, something like 60% of the world spends less than about 1% or less than 1% of its healthcare budget on mental health. So on one side, it's costing 10% of the years lost to disability. On the other side, we're only spending 1% of our healthcare budget on this. There are something like 50% of the world's population has only one qualified psychiatrist per 100,000 people. Even in the developed world, like the UK, the amount spent on health or mental health is less than 4%, same in the US. So my first observation is that there is a huge gap between supply and demand. And whenever you have a huge gap between supply and demand, it means that this is an area that even small, incremental, and incomplete solutions can make a huge impact on the lives of people. And if you put on your entrepreneur hat on, this is an industry that's certainly holding a lot of potential. Now, the second observation that I wanted to make that's related to this is around, comes from the field of innovation. And while we tend to focus on the dramatic innovations that completely revolutionize a field, we're talking about we're focusing on things like the microprocessor that completely revolutionized computers, and computers that have completely revolutionized the way we work. I think most of the innovation, though, if you look at it, comes from small incremental innovations. And while I would love to hear from our medical experts as to how psychedelics might or might not be repurposed to provide drastic solutions, I think it's more likely that we will see progress in this field through small incremental innovations over time. And some of them would certainly be through new drugs, but some of them might actually be through repurposing existing technology or developing a new technology, such as artificial intelligence systems that can offer cognitive behavioral therapy at a much more bigger scale and lower cost. And while they may not be as good as humans to begin with, if you're talking about a huge underserved population, they might offer some quick assistance for people, at least that have milder forms of mental health issues. So I'll leave it there. I mean, two observations: huge mismatch between supply and demand, which makes it ripe for disruption. But I think it's more likely that we'll see improvements through small incremental innovations over a largest period of time.
That's really thought-provoking, actually. One question that the students have for you later on in the interview is, why is alcohol legal but psychedelics are not? So I'll let you think on that whilst we go to MJ with his next question.
So exactly, just to remind everyone, we've got a period of time where you can ask your questions, so please stick around, put your questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to either ask you to ask the question yourself or pose it on your behalf. My next question is to Dr. Al-Suwaiden. Mohammad, I'm sure you've had patients who did not respond to the treatment available to you. First of all, how do you feel when a patient that you've been treating for some time does not respond to your treatment? And where do you think is the gap in the current medical treatment of mental health problems?
That's a great question, MJ. So, of course, I think as any physician, it's demoralizing when you don't have a patient respond. No doctor goes into healthcare saying, you know, I want to be the doctor that prescribes 1 or 2 or 3 medications and adds on psychotherapy and adds on, you know, exercise and adds on everything we're doing. And yet you have some people not responding to depressive disorders or anxiety disorders or post-traumatic stress, which are notoriously difficult conditions to treat. And I remember when I first went into residency training in Toronto, there was a landmark trial published in psychiatry. Maybe psychiatrists on the panel would recognize this trial, called the STAR-D trial. And the STAR-D trial was looking at basically the response rates to antidepressants in a naturalistic treatment setting, multi-center throughout the United States, very well-designed trial, not funded by any pharmaceutical industry. And the surprise that came out of that trial is that it turns out that antidepressants weren't doing such a great job until you try multiple trials of antidepressants. So in the trial, there were multiple steps in the trial. At the first stage in the trial with a standard antidepressant, only somewhere about 20 to 30% of patients were responding. And it took about 5 or 6 trials before you got about 60% of patients responding or remitting. Remitting basically means an 80% reduction in their symptoms. So that was something we were feeling at the time. And I remember there was an outcry in psychiatry at the time that psychopharmacology had failed. Maybe we need to swing back the pendulum towards psychotherapy. But we know that psychoanalytic psychotherapy hadn't achieved great results, especially in terms of cost effectiveness. And so there was this huge gap, and you see that gap clinically. Now, I want to be very clear because certainly today in psychiatry, we're not where we were 50 years ago, not even 20 years ago. Today, we have treatments that save lives, that have much less side effects than we had even 10 or 15 years ago. Yet a gap remains. So many patients don't improve fully. They only get partial improvement. That wouldn't be acceptable by a cardiologist. I mean, if someone's blood pressure went down from 190 over 130 to 150 over 100, that's not acceptable until you get it normal. And it's the same. I mean, partially treated depression is still not great. A lot of symptoms that we're just starting to recognize, you know, people's moods improve, but maybe their functionality, their cognition is not improving. Their drive for life, their pleasure-seeking behavior is not improving. And also, a lot of patients I see with depression or trauma will tell you, I feel even with all the treatments that you've given me, I've improved, but there's something that's broken, and it's never really come back since then. I'm very appreciative to you for getting me 60, 70% better, but I'm not there. And as a doctor, it's very difficult to deal with that. The other part that's difficult to deal with is someone getting better, but they're having a lot of side effects with the medication. And sometimes those side effects are cognitive or emotional blunting. And so people feel less sad, but they have a cap on their happiness. And that's also something frustrating. Nonetheless, I mean, you work with people and you tell them, I'm going to use the best science we have, and we'll work together and we'll partner and we'll hope for a better, something coming in the future. And I think the topic we're discussing today may be one of those hopes. I think working in psychedelic research, there's a, if you will, an occupational hazard of being exuberant. But and we want to be careful about that. So I'm very careful to say something's a miracle cure, but it's certainly something that we haven't seen in the landscape of psychiatry for a long time.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Steph?
Yeah, so, well, actually, to the point that we have in the chat and to the point that you don't want to be exuberant, and there is a lot of conservatism that we need to adopt when we're researching these topics. And I think Daniel has come across this before. Not Daniel, sorry, it's Danielle. There's a Daniel asking a question and a Danielle. I can't help it. I have to weave in a question from the audience because it's just so good. And this is going to be for you, Dr. David Rabin, regarding the stigma. So my question was going to be, what are psychedelics? Why were they banned? And why do they have a bad rap? And I'm weaving that into what Daniel has said here. Do you think that there is a stigma associated with the research into these drugs? I'm wary even of mentioning my interest of these compounds to my PhD supervisor. How can we reduce the stigma? So because it's sort of related to my question, I thought I'd pose that to you. And also because you are a PhD professor and you've actually been through this process. So I thought maybe you could talk about the stigma and why they were banned and what psychedelics are anyway.
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. Can you hear me okay? So thank you so much for the question. I am a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, and I'm also a practitioner of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which most people don't know is actually the only psychedelic medicine that's legal in every state of the United States and almost every country of the world. It was originally developed as an anesthetic agent that was found to have properties that induced altered states of consciousness, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about psychedelic medicine. And then also I'm trained as an MDMA assisted psychotherapist with the MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies in the United States, which is pioneering the FDA trials of MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD, and also facilitating clinical trials with the FDA for cannabis and psilocybin. So I think the first place to start with psychedelic medicine is, yes, it is stigmatized, unfortunately, because people misused medicine in the past. Is it fairly stigmatized? I would say not at all, because people misuse lots of medicine. We have an opioid epidemic right now. Is that considered to be a Schedule I drug? No. We have alcohol epidemics. As you were mentioning earlier, people kill themselves with alcohol on a regular basis. It's much more dangerous than most psychedelic medicine, and yet that is not stigmatized. It's served in every street corner or multiple places, right? So there is certainly an unfair stigmatization, which was politicized in the United States because, unfortunately, and Rick Doblin talks about this very nicely in his TED Talk, there was an unfortunate association between the advent of psychedelic medicines such as LSD and their convergence with the anti-Vietnam War movement, which ultimately resulted in a politicization in the United States of psychedelic medicine, rather than looking at it from the standpoint of a medicine, right? And so we started to look at it from the standpoint of, this is something that has the capacity to cause significant amounts of social unrest, that the government could potentially lose control over its population, which, if you look at the United States right now and anybody's watching the news, I wouldn't say we're too far off from that anyway. And psychedelic drugs are banned, and we have a war on drugs right now, which for the past several decades has really been a total catastrophe. So should we say politically and socially, are we better off that psychedelic medicines are stigmatized and illegal? I think most scientists and physicians and also policymakers would now agree that that is absolutely not the case. But I think the most important thing about this is getting back to what psychedelic really means, because this was a term that was coined about these medicines that was not always the term we used for the medicines, but psychedelic was the term that stuck because what it means is mind manifesting. So mind manifesting refers to the ability for us, whether you use a medicine or not, to become aware of what is beneath our conscious experience. So as Freud and Carl Jung and many of the fathers and mothers of psychotherapy have talked about for over 100 years, and then also going back into Eastern and tribal medicine practices for thousands of years, psychedelic means becoming aware of what is beneath our awareness normally, within our subconscious space. Consciousness refers to what you're hearing and experiencing right now that you're aware of. But then there's a million, billion, trillion other things going on around us at this very moment that we are not aware of, but they're still happening. And they're still recorded in our bodies, in our minds. So what we do in psychotherapy and what we do in meditation practice and yoga practice and many other traditional medicine practices that don't rely on medicine specifically is we teach our clients techniques that are basically thought techniques to go introspectively into ourselves and to look at ourselves and bring forth or become aware of what is typically underneath or beneath our awareness in our subconscious space, as Freud termed it, and then manifest that within our conscious, normal waking awareness experience. And so that's what psychedelic really means. What psychedelic medicines are, like MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, and ayahuasca, and all the others, is that they are biochemical catalysts that facilitate an accelerated mind manifesting process. So what we see as psychotherapists and psychiatrists was something that was discovered in the 50s and 60s, starting with LSD, and why LSD was such a phenomenal compound for assisting with mental health treatments is that's what it was originally used for when it was developed, as the same with MDMA, is that these medicines can literally catalyze the psychotherapy experience so that we can do, as therapists, sometimes a decade's worth of psychotherapeutic work with a patient or a client who normally might take 10 plus years to make those kinds of changes without the assistance of the tool, the medicine. So psychedelic medicines are not exactly unique in that way because, as I said, there are lots of other tools that we can use to access these altered states of consciousness that facilitate healing. We have wearable technology now that can do that. Like Apollo Neuroscience is a technology we developed at the University of Pittsburgh that actually works along this pathway. We know soothing human touch can induce altered states. Intimacy can induce altered states to facilitate healing. Soothing music prepared in the right way can do this. Powerful emotional empathic relationships can do this. Meditation can do this. Yoga can do this. Breath work. So psychedelic medicines are the biochemical way to facilitate and access these states. So I think when we think about it that way, it's really important to frame it in that regard so that that's how we can talk about what we're actually researching.
Well, I have to say, not only are all the treatments that you mentioned a complete different level, so is this MBA program. That it really is. MJ, can I go off script and just take one question from the floor? I know it really annoys you. Is that okay?
It does. Okay, sure.
I need to go to Roger, but before that, I've received a private question, and this is again for you, Dr. David Rabin, if that's okay. What is the opinion on Western techniques such as psychotherapy and Eastern meditations and mindfulness as a longer-term proven drug-free practice compared to psychedelic medicine? Now, the reason why I'm asking this question to you is because of your Apollo wearable technology. So do you want to weave that in? Psychedelics, traditional Western medicine, for want of a better term, and then
Sure.
a wearable technology or meditation, just nothing at all in that sense, other than an altered state of thinking. Can we compare those four perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tie it back to what Nico was talking about earlier. So ultimately, the Western paradigm of mental health, and part of the biggest issue that we have right now, struggling to treat mental health with the Western paradigm only, is that the Western paradigm has us as psychiatrists or physicians prescribing medicine for patients or clients to take that they have to take indefinitely. So we prescribe medicines they take one or multiple times a day, every day, and we tell people that they have to take these medicines for the rest of their lives. That is actually an extremely damaging thing to tell our clients or our patients, because effectively what it does is, without the education of what the medicines are doing, then we're effectively telling people to externalize the locus of healing, to say in their minds, whether they consciously recognize it or not, we're teaching them to say that, or to believe that they require a medicine from outside of themselves or anything from outside of themselves to heal. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because ultimately healing from mental illness is something that we have the capacity to do ourselves. And we know this now from, I mean, we've known this for thousands of years, observationally from Eastern and tribal medicine. But we now know this, that psychedelic medicines work in the same way, because in the studies of psychedelic medicines, we see that just one dose of medicine with psychotherapy for several weeks after, or in the case of MDMA in the FDA trials, just 3 doses of medicine with 12 weeks of psychotherapy and no other treatment can transform people who have had treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder for over 17 years on average to people 5 years out, 67% are no longer meeting diagnostic criteria for PTSD. That is incredible, right? So that is something that Western medicine has never seen in terms of results with the kinds of medicines we use. When people stop the treatment in Western medicine, all the studies show that their relapses get worse, the severity of their relapses get worse, the severity of their symptoms in general gets worse. And so what we're showing people is, with Western medicine, that you require pills every day to get better. You require something outside of yourself to get better. Whereas the psychedelic paradigm, which is very similar to, if not the same as the Eastern and tribal paradigm, is that, hey, we as the clinicians, our role is to help teach you or remind you of the skills that you have inside of you to heal yourself, to restart that internal healing process. The MAPS protocol calls it the inner healing intelligence, or our intuitive healing intelligence. And this part of ourselves is always there. And so when you reactivate that with the biochemical process of the psychedelic medicine, what we're seeing is that people not only get substantially better with just a few doses of medicine and 12 weeks of psychotherapy in the MDMA side of things, but we actually see that after the treatment, 53% roughly of people no longer meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD 2 months out, but 5 years out, 67% are no longer meeting diagnostic criteria. So they're learning so much from this 12 weeks and just 3 doses of medicine that they're actually continuing to use their skills to make themselves better for years later. And that is the paradigm shift that we're really talking about. That's an old paradigm shift in terms of the way we think about healing, but psychedelics show us that we can really speed that up rapidly for people who have forgotten or never really learned how to self-heal.
Wow, thank you very much for that.
Thanks, David. Dr. McIntyre, how would you see these psychedelic compounds fitting into the treatment landscape?
Yeah, and I think that it's important to start off with, a reaction to the moniker psychedelics as a category. And I think what we need to be aware, and you're probably hearing this through some of the other speakers already as I've been listening in, that it's important that we disaggregate the agents under this broad, very encompassing moniker called psychedelics, because there's a whole variety of agents that are very different, not only with respect to their pharmacology, not only with respect to where they're at in terms of their scientific development, but also with respect to their regulatory approvals. So that's an important preface. Moving into now a more specific answer to the question, where I see them fitting in. Now, part of this depends on the jurisdiction that people live in. I'm here in Canada, in the United States, similar but different. Other parts of the world will be similar but different. But some of the factors that influence the positioning, the sequencing of medicines are less a function of the science and more a function of the reimbursement market, other structural matters within the healthcare system, in many cases are as, if not more, relevant to that process than is the actual science. So we'll put that out there as well. It's worth mentioning that of the agents you've been hearing about, ketamine is the agent that has clearly crossed the finish line with respect to demonstrating the first thing being safety, and the second thing being efficacy, largely in the short term in people who have what we call treatment-resistant depression. Dr. Al-Swaden eloquently described the outcomes that are often observed in people who have depression, and often those outcomes far short of what the clinician's hoping for, and certainly infinitely short of what the patients and families are hoping for. So there are about a half a dozen to a dozen definitions of what treatment-resistant depression is or might be. And the most common working definition that most regulators embrace in Europe and the United States, the two most powerful regulators, is when a person has had an insufficient outcome with at least 2 medications for that depression. And that is, in fact, how ketamine has been studied. Now, just a couple of weeks ago in the United States, the United States Food and Drug Administration has now approved ketamine, one of the formulations of ketamine, to treat people who have non-treatment resistant depression, who have depression and are thinking about suicide. Now, that's important clinically because about 50 to 80% of patients who walk into a clinician's door with depression actually have suicidal thinking. It also has relevance to the question because what that immediately implies is that ketamine might be considered a treatment not of last resort or later in the algorithm, and perhaps a treatment much earlier in the algorithm. And in fact, if one reads the indication that the FDA now has for one of the formulations of ketamine concretely, it implies you could use it as a first-line treatment for a patient with depression. So I think the message is it is difficult to have a parsimony with respect to all the agents because the evidence is not there for psilocybin on the safety side or the efficacy side to even consider it as a treatment in the clinical ecosystem at this time. MDMA has got a long way to go yet with respect to its development. I often use metaphors. If the premiership was where ketamine is, the psychedelics of psilocybin and ecstasy are certainly very much at best in the junior ranks at this point with respect to getting into that sort of prime time. It's one thing to be promising, it's very different to be prime time. And it's interesting because we now have a reason to believe that ketamine could be considered possibly first line. Anecdotally, what I can tell you is this is not something that requires a hell of a lot of Socratic reasoning. I have a lot of people who call me up who are well-educated people, physicians and business people and so on, and they call me up and they say to me, I understand that ketamine is not only effective and safe, but it seems to work within 1 to 2 days. And that's true. And then they say to me, my daughter, my sister, whatever the case may be, my wife, whatever, my husband has depression. We don't want to fiddle around with those old antidepressants for 4 to 8 weeks to see if they work. Wouldn't it make more sense just to start with one of these treatments first, just to see if it works? So again, and there's a longer conversation, but I think that the short part of that conversation, that's a very reasonable thought. So the positioning of ketamine in terms of the algorithmic sequence today in most jurisdictions, like the European Agency, is for treatment-resistant depression, which tacitly implies the person has had an insufficient outcome with at least 2 treatments. In the USA, there's now, in fact, as of 2 weeks ago, a supplementary indication for people who don't have treatment-resistant depression, so that implies it could be used earlier. With respect to the other so-called psychedelics, they're not part of the clinical armamentarium at this time, and they should not be. Their safety is not established, and nor is the efficacy established with these treatments. So they would certainly be in the realm of clinical research and development. And this is an important point. I've certainly observed, and certainly I'm very hopeful about this new area of treatments. We've given several thousand ketamine infusions now to people, and we've seen the results that are reported, and we've contributed to that literature. So we share in the enthusiasm, but we also, in fact, need to be very cautious. And the caution is that the first thing you want to do when you develop a medicine is make sure you don't hurt the patient. And people often say to me, I'm a psychopharmacologist and a psychiatrist, and I've been in drug discovery and development for 25 years. People say to me, I've got this new medication and there's no side effects. And I say, that's very interesting because placebo causes side effects in 70% of people who take it. So how did you magically create a drug with no side effects? So I think we need to be very, very careful. The other part is that we really don't understand the mechanism of action of any of these drugs. We have a hypothesis. And that in itself isn't so much a crime that we're operating in the dark. That's not the crime. The crime would be if we get so much hubris that we think that this is a safe journey and there's no hazard. For example, it's possible that some of these treatments may be affecting parts of the brain that could increase the risk of things we don't want, like drug and alcohol misuse. And it's possible that we could see some other untoward events. Maybe in some people who are susceptible, it could increase suicide. These are all possibilities. Now, I would also then push back at that and say, well, anything's possible. We don't work in science in that way. We have to prove things empirically. But what I would certainly have had as my guiding principle here is really the emphasis on safety. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. And we really are a long way to go with respect to psilocybin and certainly ecstasy. And these medications have had a romantic history, not just with respect to cult and countercultural factors, but within the world of medicine. And so I think we're kind of back to the drawing board. We're going to get another chance to do this right, which we're doing, and we're going to see. We're going to see what happens. And certainly you've heard this already on the supply and the demand side. The demand for treatments is unthinkably high, and COVID only adds to that. We didn't need COVID, but it certainly added to it. And really the supply has been so anemic. So these are really exciting times. But again, I think that on the algorithm question, ketamine, certainly treatment-resistant depression, and at least now has an opportunity to be leapfrogged earlier in the algorithm.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntyre. Very insightful. Misha, Dr. Misha, Dr. McIntyre had spoken about where you are and how that influences the prospects. And from the search that I've done, it seems that Canada was leading the way, and then now the US is kind of a not too far second. But it seems that in the United Kingdom, you know, efforts seem to be absent. Maybe one reason could be that these drugs have been classified as a Class A controlled drugs, and this could hindrance research. How hard is it to navigate the landscape of psychedelics research with the law categorizing it as illegal or controlled substance?
Thanks very much, MJ. Yeah, I think it's a very difficult landscape, and but what I'm really positive, what I feel very positively about is that the FDA has granted breakthrough therapy designation to 3 different products now, and I think that other regulators will follow in that trajectory. So I think that's really positive, and it's going to take a lot of collaboration between the pharmaceutical industry and the regulators and governments to turn around the political toxicity that has marred these psychedelic medicines for years, decades and decades. So we're going to have to do a lot of work, but I think what we need to do is focus on providing avenues to bring about these clinical trials and to have robust clinical data to prove the point. And this is also, for me, about working in collaboration with people who have been using these drugs recreationally in their communities for generations to promote the psychological well-being and emotional well-being in their communities, whether that's with the shaman or not. There's a lot that we can learn from data, and data is data. It comes in all manner of different forms. And I think we need to have an open mind in the way that we look at data to undo some of the toxicity that has been done politically with these particular drugs.
Yeah, Misha, if I can add to that, I mean, I think there's a question about lobbying and sort of regulators, and I think something I want to point out is that the most important conversation you can have with the regulators is driven by clinical data, and that's really, really important because those are the clinical studies that influence regulator decisions and lead to new drug approvals, which is how we get new and alternative treatments into the paths of patients. I think to Dr. McIntyre's point earlier on, patient safety and providing, positive patient outcomes is one of the most critical things that we're focused on. And so that's really driven by data. And I think from a clinical trial point of view, we are at an early stage. There's a number of clinical trials going through with various regulators, but they are early stages. And so we're focused on safety. And sort of, I think a lot of these trials aren't looking at efficacy yet. I think there's anecdotal evidence, but it's really focused currently on safety to make sure that the on-target effects we're trying to achieve are not washed out by the off-target.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
One of the aspects about this conversation that I would like everyone to be aware of with respect to how drugs are actually developed is that, and I'll use the car at the car dealership metaphor. Most of us like to see a wonderful looking car, and you walk into the dealership and it's got that wonderful new car smell, and the stereo is great, and it looks got a great color, your favorite color, and your favorite look, and it drives off the lot with you. Most of us don't look under the hood and really appreciate the nuts and bolts of how the vehicle actually came to be. And I start off with that metaphor because we have molecules, we have these drugs that are providing promise and reason to believe. And then what happens is is that the sponsor, which is usually a private company, usually a for-profit company, will then take that product and then they will partner with a middle group. And that middle group is called the Clinical Research Organization. And the Clinical Research Organization will then take that pill and they will identify sites around the country, around the region, around the world to conduct the research on behalf of the sponsor. And that is just simply the division of labor. Thanks to Adam Smith, it's scale. Thank you very much. Good capitalism. The problem with that is dilution and the quality loss with that model. Just to give you kind of a benchmark, we know, everyone knows Prozac. Prozac's a phenomenon, and we've had Prozac since the 80s. If we did 10 trials with Prozac today through CROs, which is an effective antidepressant, not a perfect antidepressant, but it works, only about 3 of them would be positive. Only 3 would be positive. What happened to the other 7? Well, the other 7 are not going to be positive because placebo is going to beat it. And how come placebo works better in the United States than it works in England? Why is there something magical about the sugar tablet in Denver versus in London? No, it's the way studies are conducted. And there's a certain kind of mystery to this, but there's parts that are not a mystery. It's called quality on implementation. And the FDA has come out very clearly and said that the major problem in drug discovery and research in psychiatry is, yes, we need new reason to believe medicines, but we need a different way of developing them because you're losing the implementation quality through CROs. So we took this to heart, and with my organization, Champignon, what we did is we have the ability to create our own medicine, but that's only part of the challenge. The challenge is to implement. And we have our own research centers to develop the treatment in our own research center. And by doing so, what we're able to do is keep ourselves in a position of control over the quality of implementation. And frankly, that has been the mortal wound for more than 80% of drugs in psychiatry in the last 20 years. So we've had many promising drugs in the last 20 years that end up in the cemetery because of this issue. So we believe that to really have genuinely novel medicines, you have to have the scientific framework, but you have to have the implementation framework, and that's what we're doing in my organization, so that we in fact can increase the likelihood of getting across the finish line. Unfortunately, because of the fact that most organizations have to use CROs, that introduces a terrible source of uncertainty to drug development.